The barbershop was loud that afternoon, filled with laughter that didn't feel friendly. 3 young barbers in their 20s circled around Marco Rossi, grinning like they had just found easy entertainment. Marco sat quietly in the chair, hands resting on his knees, trying to ignore the comments being thrown at him. "Relax, man," one of them chuckled. "Des. We're just giving you a fresh look." Marco didn't argue. He rarely did. At 32, he had learned that silence often avoided trouble. Single father working 2 jobs, he didn't have the energy for pride battles. His 5-year-old daughter Sophia was waiting at daycare, and he still had a night shift at the warehouse. The first buzz of the clippers felt wrong. Too short. Marco's eyes shifted to the mirror, but before he could react, another barber laughed loudly. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess we're going bald today." The other 2 burst into laughter as more hair fell to the floor. "Hey, that's not what I asked for," Marco said quietly. One of them leaned closer. "You didn't specify," he replied with a smirk. "Plus, it suits you. Makes you look tougher." They kept shaving, faster now, clearly enjoying the humiliation more than the haircut itself. Customers waiting nearby noticed but stayed silent. Nobody wanted involvement. Marco's reflection stared back at him, half his head shaved unevenly. There was no fixing it now. They'd made sure of that. Marco swallowed his pride. "Just finish it," he muttered. And they did. Within minutes, his thick, dark hair was gone, placed by an uneven buzz that exposed a faint scar near the back of his head, a scar from a car accident years ago that had taken Sophia's mother from him. The barbers didn't know that. They didn't care. "See? Free upgrade," one of them joked as he brushed Marco's shoulders dramatically. "No charge. Consider it our gift." The shop filled with laughter again. Marco stood slowly, staring at himself one last time. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. He paid anyway, tipped lightly. It's not because they deserved it, but because Sophia had once asked him why he always tipped people. "'Cause kindness doesn't depend on theirs," he had told her. As Marco stepped outside, the late afternoon sun hit his bare scalp. The cool air made it worse. He felt exposed, stripped of something personal, not just hair, dignity, but he pushed the feeling down. There was no time for self-pity. Inside the shop, one barber shook his head. "Guy didn't even react," he said. "Probably too soft." Another laughed. "A total pushover." None of them noticed the black SUV that had been parked across the street for nearly 20 minutes. The driver inside had watched everything. Watched the mockery. Watched the forced shave. Watched Marco walk out without raising his voice. The SUV door opened slowly. A tall, older man stepped out, adjusting his tailored coat. His silver hair was slicked back neatly. His face was combut. His eyes were anything but. He crossed the street with unhurried steps. Inside the barbershop, the bell above the door rang as he entered. The laughter stopped. The scattered hair on the floor, the smirks fading into confusion. "Can we help you?" The room grew very still. The 3 barbers exchanged confused looks as the older man stepped fully inside the shop. "We don't know your son." The man walked slowly toward the barber chair Marco had just vacated, studying the hair scattered across the floor. He ran a finger along the armrest, then looked up. "Marco Rossi," he said calmly. 32, warehouse supervisor, single father. His eyes lifted. That Marco Rossi. A flicker of realization crossed one barber's face. "The quiet guy?" he asked, trying to laugh it off. "We were just joking around." He didn't mind. The older man tilted his head slightly. "You shaved half his head without consent," he replied evenly. "That is not a joke." The shop felt smaller suddenly. One of the customers quietly stood and slipped out the door. The barbers shifted uncomfortably. "Look," another one said defensively, "it was harmless. It's just hair. It grows back." The older man's expression did not change. Dignity does not grow back as easily. He removed his gloves slowly and placed them on the counter. "My name is Lorenzo Rossi," he continued. The name seemed to settle heavily in the air. The youngest barber's face drained of color as recognition hit him. He had heard that name before. Everyone in this part of the city had. "You're that Rossi?" the barber whispered. Lorenzo did not confirm it directly. He didn't need to. The 2 men who had stepped quietly inside behind him made the answer obvious enough. They stood near the door, silent and watchful. Lorenzo walked closer to the mirror where Marco had sat. "My son does not speak much about his past," he said softly. "He does not tell people who his father is. He works hard. He raises his daughter with humility." His voice sharpened slightly. "And today, you mistook his silence for weakness." The tension in the room thickened. Outside, the black SUV engine remained running. One barber attempted a weak smile. "You cannot fix what you already chose to do. But you can decide what kind of men you will be after today." The youngest barber stepped forward first. The others quickly echoed the apology. Lorenzo watched them carefully, measuring sincerity. Finally, he straightened his coat. "Tomorrow morning," he said calmly, "you will visit my son's home. You will apologize to him and to his daughter." The barbers nodded rapidly. Lorenzo moved toward the door, then paused. Without turning around, he added quietly, "And understand this clearly. My son may choose humility. God." The bell above the door rang as he exited, leaving behind a silence far heavier than the laughter that had filled the shop before. By the time Lorenzo stepped back into the black SUV, he didn't want the looks. When Sophia ran into his arms, she stopped for a second and stared at him. "Papa, where's your hair?" she asked innocently, touching his scalp with tiny fingers. Marco forced a smile. "I tried something new," he replied gently. "Do you like it?" Sophia giggled. "You look like a superhero," she said confidently. The words softened the sting more than any apology could have. Marco carried her home, listening to her chatter about school, pretending everything was normal. He didn't tell her what happened. He didn't want her learning that cruelty existed so casually in the world. Later that evening, as Sophia slept, Marco stood in the bathroom staring at his reflection again. His uneven shave looked harsher under the bright light. He ran his hand across his head slowly. It wasn't about vanity. It was about the laughter, a deliberate choice to embarrass him. His phone buzzed. It was his father. Marco stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. He and Lorenzo had a complicated relationship, one built on distance and unspoken rules. "Papa," Marco said quietly. "I visited your barbershop," Lorenzo replied calmly. Marco froze. "You did what?" His chest tightened instantly. "You promised you wouldn't involve yourself in my life like that." Lorenzo's voice remained steady. "I did not involve myself in your life. I corrected disrespect." Marco exhaled sharply. "I don't want that world touching Sophia," he said firmly. "That's why I left. That's why I don't use your name." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "And I respect that," Lorenzo answered. "But understand something, Marco. Choosing peace does not mean accepting humiliation." Marco leaned against the wall, conflicted. "It was just hair," he muttered. "It wasn't worth trouble." Lorenzo's tone softened slightly. "It was not about hair. It was about how they treated you because they believed you had no power." The words unsettled Marco. He had worked hard to build a life separate from his father's reputation, a life based on honest work and quiet dignity. "I don't want fear protecting me," he said finally. "I want respect earned." "And you have earned it," Lorenzo replied calmly. "That is why I did not break bones. I demanded accountability." Marco was silent. That was, in its own way, restraint. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, there was a knock at Marco's apartment door. Marco opened it cautiously. The three barbers stood there, dressed simply, no smirks this time. The youngest one held a small gift bag awkwardly in his hands. "We're here to apologize," he said quietly. Marco glanced down the hallway to make sure Sophia was still inside. "For what?" he asked evenly. The barber swallowed. "The second barber stepped forward, and for disrespecting you in front of others. We were wrong." Marco stepped aside slowly. "Come in," he said. Sophia peeked from behind the couch. "Papa, who are they?" she whispered. Marco knelt beside her. "Men who are learning something important," he answered softly. The three barbers apologized again, this time directly to Sophia for hurting her father's feelings. Sophia nodded seriously. "Papa is strong," she said proudly. Marco felt something shift inside him, not anger, not shame, but quiet clarity. After they left, Marco called his father again. "He came," he said simply. Lorenzo responded just as simply. "Good." There was no celebration in his voice, just finality. Marco stood by the window, watching the city move as it always did. He had chosen a different path from his father, but for the first time he understood something clearly. Power was not always about force. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to stand behind someone without stepping in front of them. By the following week, word had spread quietly through the people were curious. They began looking at Marco Rossi differently. One supervisor even approached him about a promotion opportunity that had never been mentioned before. Marco didn't ask questions. He simply worked the way he always had, steady, reliable, focused. The gates opened silently as they arrived, and Sophia's eyes widened at the size of the house. Something like that? Inside, Lorenzo greeted Sophia first, kneeling slightly to her level. "You must be the superhero expert," he said warmly. Sophia giggled and nodded. Marco watched carefully. His father's world had always been powerful, intimidating, and sharp-edged. But around Sophia, it softened. During dinner, Lorenzo spoke calmly. "Respect is currency," he said, cutting a steak with precision. "Some earn it through fear. Others earn it through character." He looked directly at Marco. "You chose the harder path." Marco met his father's gaze. "'Cause I want Sophia to grow up proud, not protected by shadows." Lorenzo nodded slowly. "That is why you are stronger than you think." The admission surprised Marco. His father rarely offered praise. For years, Marco believed leaving that world meant rejection. Now he saw it differently. It meant independence. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The barbershop posted a public apology on social media. No names were mentioned, but the message was clear. They had humiliated someone and learned from it. The post went viral locally. Customers commented about accountability, about maturity, about growth. Marco read it quietly one night after Sophia fell asleep. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt calm. The humiliation that once burned in his chest now felt distant. What remained was something steadier self-respect. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had simply stood firm in who he was. The following weekend, Marco walked back into that same barbershop. The atmosphere changed instantly. No laughter. Shh. No whispers. Just professional nods. "How would you like it today?" one barber asked respectfully. Marco removed his cap slowly. "Just clean it up," he replied evenly. Even cut. As the clippers buzzed this time, the room was quiet, not tense, but careful. When the cut was finished, Marco looked in the mirror. Clean, balanced, intentional. He tipped generously, and paused at the door. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said calmly. "Just don't waste it." Outside, Sophia waited in the car seat, humming to herself. "Papa, do you feel strong?" she asked as he started the engine. Marco glanced at her through the rearview mirror and smiled. "Strength isn't loud," he said gently. "It's knowing who you are when others try to decide it for you." Across town, Lorenzo watched the city skyline from his office window. He had built an empire through control, but that day he felt pride for a different reason. His son did not need his shadow. He stood in his own light. The lesson spread quietly through the streets. Never mistake silence for weakness. And never underestimate a man who chooses dignity over intimidation.